To its credit, the House Homeland Security Committee today is holding a hearing into what may prove to be an avoidable catastrophe. It's easy to lose sight of it and the importance this hearing could have with all of the distractions that the Obama's programs for cap and trade energy tax and healthcare reform and hate crimes legislation have created up on the Hill. But this hearing may be the difference between a disaster of the first order for the United States of America and the prompt, if belated, attention to a problem that, if not addressed, will certainly result in catastrophe. What am I talking about? I'm talking about a phenomenon known as electromagnetic pulse and the vulnerability of our electrical grid to it and to related phenomena that could result, if we're not careful, in the cratering, not just the damaging for a long period of time, but the actual physical destruction of the nation's electrical infrastructure, and with it, all of the other infrastructures upon which our 21st century society depends so completely. One of the people testifying at today's hearing is President Reagan's science advisor, Dr. William Graham, an eminent nuclear physicist and accomplished scientist. He has been chairing a blue ribbon commission on the electromagnetic pulse threat that has reported several times now to the United States Congress, but not, I'm sorry to say, with the desired effect. And worse yet, the commission has been disestablished before its job really has been done, namely to try to fix the sorts of vulnerabilities that have been identified in their several reports. What the commission has talked about as a particular worry is the possibility that a country could, or perhaps terrorists, if they could get their hands on the pieces of equipment that they need, bring a ship close to our shores, erect aboard it a missile, perhaps even a relatively short-range one, fire the missile into space high over the United States and detonate the nuclear weapon aboard it. What that would do would be to precipitate this widespread phenomenon known as electromagnetic pulse. And everything in line of sight of that detonation, which depending on the altitude of the burst could be quite a distance, would be subjected to perhaps the effect of a radio signal 1,000,000 times stronger than any known to man to date. That kind of electromagnetic pulse would, as I said, have a devastating effect on things like transformers that constitute the backbone of our electrical grid and electronic devices that are necessary for our computers and everything that they power. And when, as would happen, the electrical grid goes down as a result of that kind of damage, every other piece of infrastructure for food, for transportation, for telecommunications, for medical services, for water, for sewage, and the like, all would also be devastated and would take perhaps a long time to bring back up because you'd have to replace the damaged pieces of the gear, not simply reboot. No less worrying than the fact that the Russians and Chinese already are in a position to use such an electromagnetic pulse attack against us, but that the North Koreans and the Iranians are working to put themselves in a similar position, and perhaps others. We also have a phenomenon that is not man-caused, as they like to say at the Homeland Security Department, but naturally occurring, namely something called the Carrington Event. It happened back in September of 1859. Scientists say that the cycle is typically about a 100-year recurrence. We haven't had one since the dawn of the electronic age, but NASA and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration recently put out a report indicating they expect the next of these Carrington events to take place by May of 2013. And what we know from the last time it happened, when there were telegraph wires that burst into flame and telegraph offices that similarly were destroyed, is that our currently unhardened electrical system and electronic devices and the like would be similarly and probably devastatingly affected by the next Carrington event if we have not taken steps to protect them. The Committee on Homeland Security of the House is going to also hear about yet another way in which the United States electrical grid could be savaged, namely through cyber warfare, that is to say, attacks using computers against the computers that operate our electrical grid. We've already been subjected to some of that, though to date, thankfully, they've mostly been nuisances rather than really problematic. But there's nothing to say that the states or others who have engaged in this kind of cyber attacks, if you will, or efforts to establish what is the vulnerability, what is the sensitivity, what kind of corrective actions would we take. But were they serious about taking down our grid, it's distinctly possible that that could be done with an effect not dissimilar to that we would experience were one of these man-made or naturally induced EMP attacks to take place. In short, the House Homeland Security Committee is today going to hear from Dr. Graham and other scientists and officials in the United States government about these problems. My prayerful hope is that they will take the next step, one, to reconstitute the EMP Commission, which should never have been allowed to elapse. Its monitoring of our vulnerability and its advocacy for the sorts of corrective actions, some of which can be taken relatively easily and relatively inexpensively. But its advocacy is needed now more than ever. And then the committee needs to help engineer a happy circumstance that we now have into real corrective action, namely that in the stimulus bill that was enacted earlier this year, there's a considerable amount of money, billions of dollars, set aside for upgrading our electrical grid, something that's long overdue and certainly necessary. When that upgrading takes place, early in the planning process, we must build in the idea of resiliency for the grid to ensure that these present serious and potentially catastrophic vulnerabilities are not simply replicated in a new grid. And that would be madness, especially when we know for sure, set aside the question of whether somebody might use a ballistic missile to attack us in this sort of EMP laydown. Just we know that the Carrington event is coming. It would be the height of irresponsibility not to take the sorts of steps that we know the EMP Commission has established and that senior people in the government are aware could make the kind of catastrophic outcome that I've just described not only avoidable, but avoided. I hope you'll help spread the word on this point. It's very important that we all get behind the sorts of corrective actions that are now so clearly needed to counter EMP and cyber warfare attacks against our electrical grid. Thanks for listening.